Knocking on wood is supposed to save you from bad luck, not put you in a wooden box. But today's Darwin Award contenders decided ancient folklore was way better than basic survival instincts. Quick disclaimer: do not replace common sense with crystal energy or lucky charms, because gravity always wins. Here are 10 people who literally let stupid superstitions drag them straight to the morgue. 1. Picture a gloomy Tuesday morning on the floor of a mid-sized metal fabrication plant, a place where the air smells perpetually of ozone, stale coffee, and pending OSHA violations. Amidst the deafening symphony of grinding steel stood our first victim, a machinist named Gary, who had recently returned from a spiritual weekend retreat with a profound misunderstanding of how physics actually operates. Gary wasn't just a stubborn employee. He was a walking workplace hazard wrapped in a spiritual awakening, entirely convinced his newfound enlightenment made him immune to the unforgiving realities of kinetic energy. His prized possession, and the ultimate instrument of his spectacularly preventable demise, was a massive, incredibly heavy protective talisman necklace made of thick braided leather and dense river stones. Gary proudly insisted this chunky piece of jewelry emanated an aura of total physical invulnerability, essentially acting as a magical force field against flying shrapnel. Now, anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes in a machine shop understands the fundamental rule of industrial equipment. You absolutely do not wear loose, dangling items around things that spin faster than the speed of sound. Gary was operating an industrial lathe, a massive beast designed to effortlessly shave solid steel blocks into tiny ribbons at thousands of revolutions per minute. The floor supervisor, a man who had survived 30 years in manufacturing by actually reading warning labels, explicitly told Gary to remove the absurd necklace before powering up. Gary smugly brushed off the warning, proudly patting his chest and declaring the blessed stones were a shield against all harm. He treated a vital safety protocol like an optional software update he could just endlessly ignore. As the lathe spun up to its terrifying maximum velocity, screaming like a banshee trapped in a blender, Gary leaned in dangerously close to inspect a steel cylinder. He completely ignored the fact that his mystical chest boulder was dangling directly over a vortex of spinning death. It's almost beautiful how quickly the universe corrects overwhelming arrogance. The moment that heavy leather cord grazed the rapidly spinning metal, the lathe violently claimed ownership, acting as a high-speed mechanical winch with zero forgiveness. Because the guru who sold Gary the necklace had prioritized durability over breakaway safety clasps, the leather didn't snap. Instead, it instantly yanked Gary face first into the rotational force of the machine with the unstoppable power of a runaway freight train. The protective amulet functioned as a perfectly designed tow cable, pulling him directly into the heavy steel components and causing a catastrophic, instantaneous, and highly fatal collision between his skull and the uncompromising reality of heavy manufacturing. In a morbidly poetic conclusion, the investigation report noted that while the machine sustained minor cosmetic damage, the supposedly unbreakable talisman survived the ordeal entirely intact, perfectly preserving its mystical energy long after they had to tag Gary's toe in the county morgue. 2. If there is a universal truth we can all agree on, it's that adrenaline and profound stupidity mix about as well as a toaster in a full bathtub, a fact brilliantly illustrated by an amateur daredevil named Kyle. Kyle was the kind of guy who viewed basic vehicle maintenance as a scam perpetrated by greedy mechanics, firmly believing that positive vibes and sheer willpower were more than enough to keep a clapped-out, second-hand sport bike held together at highway speeds. He had recently purchased a brutally abused motorcycle off a sketchy internet ad, a machine that looked less like a sleek vehicle and more like a rolling cry for help, complete with tires balder than a cue ball and brake lines visibly fraying like the ends of a chewed-up shoelace. When his infinitely more rational riding buddy pointed out that hydraulic fluid was actively seeping from the dry, rotted rubber hoses and suggested they maybe fix the things that stopped the bike from becoming an unguided missile, Kyle enthusiastically rejected the advice with a condescending chuckle. Instead of investing $50 in parts that would literally save his life, Kyle proudly reached into his pocket and produced his ultimate foolproof insurance policy. a violently neon pink, deeply synthetic Lucky Rabbit's foot keychain he had just purchased next to the beef jerky at a severely run-down highway gas station. He firmly patted the cheap, shedding fluff ball against the motorcycle's gas tank, smugly assuring his terrified friend that this mass-produced trinket held enough ancient, mystical luck to completely override the fundamental laws of friction and fluid dynamics. Now, for those who skipped high school physics, a hydraulic braking system requires pressurized fluid to force the brake pads against the rotors. When the hose carrying that fluid bursts under extreme pressure, squeezing the brake lever suddenly transitions from a life-saving action to a completely useless hand exercise. Armed with nothing but misplaced faith in a deceased rodent's foot, Kyle blindly cranked the throttle and rocketed up a famously treacherous mountain pass, a winding stretch of road known for massive drop-offs, unforgiving hairpin turns, and absolutely zero guardrails. As he arrogantly pushed the vibrating death trap to a blistering 90 miles per hour on a downhill straightaway, perfectly setting himself up for the sharpest, deadliest curve on the entire mountain, he finally decided it was time to engage the brakes and smoothly carve the corner. He squeezed the lever with all his might, but instead of the reassuring bite of brake pads gripping steel, he was instantly greeted by the terrifyingly hollow pop of his ancient brake line completely rupturing, violently spraying highly flammable hydraulic fluid all over the scorching engine block. The lucky pink rabbit's foot flapped uselessly in the roaring wind, absolutely useless in its designated protective duties, as Kyle blew past the curve completely unabated. He launched his motorcycle over the rocky precipice, experiencing a breathtakingly brief, unpowered flight before abruptly relocating to the rocky bottom of the canyon. In a cruelly fitting epilogue to his bargain bin risk management strategy, the recovery team later found his mangled keys in the wreckage and unanimously agreed the neon pink rabbit's foot should be shipped back to that highway gas station with a handwritten note reading, "Defective product." Did not prevent high-speed canyon relocation. Though in fairness, the fine print on a $2 Lucky Charm probably doesn't cover voluntary brake failure at 90 miles per hour. 3. Have you ever wanted something so intensely, so desperately, that your brain simply short-circuits and completely shuts down your most basic, evolutionary survival instincts just to achieve a meaningless symbolic victory? Welcome to the shockingly bloodthirsty and fiercely competitive arena of the traditional bridal bouquet toss, an event that transformed our next fatally flawed protagonist, a determined bridesmaid named Sarah, into a tragic casualty at the altar of romantic desperation. Sarah was a woman whose overwhelming desire to walk down the aisle had escalated from a mild personal goal into a full-blown, terrifying obsession. She viewed the ancient superstition that catching the bride's flying flowers guaranteed you'd be the next one to get married not as a silly party game, but as an absolute binding cosmic contract. The setting for this spectacular display of misplaced priorities was an admittedly breathtaking premium destination wedding perched precariously on the very edge of a dramatic, towering sea cliff. It was a location that offered unparalleled panoramic views of the ocean, alongside a sheer, lethal, 100-foot drop straight down into churning surf and jagged rocks. Because aesthetic elegance almost always takes precedence over rigorous safety standards at luxury weddings, the only thing separating the mildly intoxicated wedding guests from a magnificent plunge into the rocky abyss was a remarkably flimsy, temporary rope barrier that looked like it couldn't stop a determined golden retriever. As the reception entered its final hours and the DJ loudly announced the legendary bouquet toss, Sarah shoved her way to the very front of the pack of single women, throwing ruthless elbows and adopting the wide-eyed, intense athletic stance of a professional football player preparing for a game-winning catch. The bride dramatically turned her back to the crowd and faced the open ocean, gave a theatrical countdown, and hurled the tightly bound bundle of expensive floral arrangements high into the coastal breeze, sending it on a steep, unpredictable arc that sailed up and over the entire crowd behind her. Sarah, absolutely blinded by romantic ambition and completely losing all sense of her physical surroundings, instantly locked her eyes onto the airborne flowers like a laser-guided missile system. She blindly backpedaled away from the group to track the arc of the descending prize, marching backward with frantic, unblinking determination. She completely ignored the warning gasps of the crowd, blissfully unaware that her frantic reverse sprint was taking her directly through the pathetic, decorative rope barrier that was supposed to keep people alive. In a truly stunning display of hand-eye coordination completely ruined by a catastrophic lack of spatial awareness, Sarah perfectly snagged the bouquet out of the air in a triumphant grip at the exact, horrifying millisecond her high heels stepped backward into empty space. Her victorious shriek seamlessly transitioned into a terrified scream as gravity enthusiastically took over, pulling her down 100 feet to abruptly meet the punishing shoreline below. It was a tragically dramatic exit that definitely made her the center of attention, though, ironically, securing that wedding superstition guaranteed the next large gathering. Her friends dressed up for certainly wouldn't feature a multi-tiered cake or an open bar. 4. Let's talk about the majestic beauty of the great outdoors, a picturesque landscape that essentially serves as a gigantic, interactive casino for people who genuinely believe the universe cares about their spare change. Enter our next heavily misguided protagonist, a deeply superstitious tourist named Craig, who operated under the rock-solid delusion that tossing low-value currency into moving bodies of water was a legally binding contract for cosmic favors. Craig wasn't satisfied with simply lobbing a penny into a stagnant shopping mall fountain like a normal, moderately sane human being. He firmly believed that the velocity and danger of the water directly correlated to the quality of the granted wish. This spectacularly flawed logic brought him to the absolute edge of a roaring, incredibly violent mountain waterfall, a furious cascade of freezing water that mercilessly plunged 30 feet straight down into a perilous gauntlet of jagged, skull-splitting granite boulders. The local park rangers had decorated this specific scenic overlook with a very generous assortment of brightly colored, highly legible warning signs, explicitly telling visitors to stay behind the sturdy metal railings, basically begging people not to become a paperwork nightmare for the county coroner. Craig, however, treated these desperate safety warnings like uninvited pop-up ads, casually stepping over the barricade because he needed his lucky silver dollar to land absolutely perfectly in the exact dead center of the raging current to ensure maximum wish-granting efficiency. Now, a quick vital lesson in basic geology and friction. When naturally smooth river rocks are constantly misted by a thundering waterfall, they cultivate a thick layer of green algae that essentially possesses the exact same friction coefficient as a bowling lane coated in warm butter. Armed with a pocket full of dreams and a pair of utterly useless canvas sneakers, Craig precariously tiptoed out onto this incredibly slick, sloping geological death trap. He was entirely focused on his shiny coin and completely ignored the primal alarm bells of basic human survival instincts. He extended his arm out over the thundering abyss, closed his eyes to furiously manifest his profound desire for a workplace promotion, and recklessly shifted his entire body weight forward to execute the perfect, aerodynamic coin drop. At that precise, horrifying fraction of a second, the deceptively slick, algae-covered rock eagerly betrayed his terrible footwear, instantly eliminating every single ounce of traction he thought he possessed. Craig's feet violently shot out from underneath him in an absurd, cartoonish display of failed gravity management. This instantly transformed his carefully planned magical ritual into a frantic, utterly helpless freefall alongside his depreciating silver dollar. He plunged down the steep, roaring 30-foot drop, a screaming blur of khaki shorts and tragic misplaced faith, before coming to a sudden, highly traumatic and unquestionably fatal stop against the merciless, jagged teeth of the riverbed below. In a twisted, darkly poetic form of environmental irony, the recovery dive team later noted that his exceptionally shiny coin did, in fact, land perfectly in the absolute center of the lower pool, presumably successfully granting his deeply held subconscious wish to permanently escape the stressful grind of the corporate rat race forever. 5. There is a very specific, deeply ingrained brand of panic that completely overrides human logic when you are running catastrophically late for a commercial flight, a blinding frenzy that transforms ordinary people into frantic lunatics. This chaotic energy violently collided with a bizarre southern superstition in the foyer of our next victim, a highly stressed business traveler named Bo, who was about to learn a brutal lesson about the structural integrity of interior design. Beau was a man raised on a strict diet of absolute paranoia, deeply conditioned to believe that if you leave your house and are forced to cross the threshold back inside for a forgotten item, you absolutely must sit down and count to 10, or else a horrific wave of catastrophic bad luck will hunt you down for the rest of the day. As Beau frantically sprinted out his front door, throwing luggage into a waiting cab, his blood ran utterly cold as he realized his leather wallet was still sitting mockingly on his kitchen counter. He madly dashed back into the house, his heart hammering against his ribs, consumed by the terrifying certainty that his upcoming flight would plummet from the sky unless he performed his mandatory luck-resetting ritual. Here is a fundamental law of home furnishings that Beau's panic-addled brain completely failed to process. Decorative accent furniture is meant to hold car keys and unopened mail, not to absorb the sudden, highly kinetic impact of a desperate 200-pound adult male. Beau wildly scanned his immediate surroundings in the entryway, realizing his comfortable living room sofa was entirely too far away to sacrifice precious seconds. His desperate eyes locked instead onto a ridiculously flimsy, half-moon glass console table, precariously perched on incredibly cheap metal legs. Driven by pure superstition and a total disregard for physics, Beau didn't just gently perch on the edge of the delicate fixture. He heedlessly threw his entire, substantial body weight backward, executing a massive, forceful drop onto the razor-thin glass surface as he frantically began to scream numbers into the hallway. The fragile glass surface never stood a chance, emitting a terrifying, ear-piercing crack before instantly disintegrating into 1,000 jagged guillotines beneath his descending mass. Instead of successfully resetting his mystical aura, Beau crashed heavily through the shattered remnants of his terrible furniture choices, landing heavily within a nightmarish pile of weaponized debris. In a grotesquely display of extreme physical misfortune, a massive shard of razor-sharp glass decisively ended the debate between superstition and furniture physics, inflicting the kind of instantly catastrophic damage that no amount of desperate counting to 10 was ever going to fix. Beau enthusiastically bypassed any potential bad luck at the airport security checkpoint by permanently clocking out on his expensive hardwood floors in a matter of violently chaotic minutes, tragically failing to even reach the count of 3. The impatient cab driver honking outside entirely missed the cosmic comedy, unaware that his frantic passenger had successfully avoided the mild inconvenience of a delayed flight by aggressively canceling every single appointment he would ever make for the rest of eternity. 6. Childhood playground rhymes are theoretically designed to keep toddlers entertained, but for a shockingly tiny subset of the adult population, these catchy little verses evolve into crippling, binding directives that completely override basic spatial awareness. Meet Arthur, a fully grown 42-year-old accountant who consistently moved through a bustling metropolitan city with the frantic, twitchy paranoia of a man constantly navigating an active, heavily armed minefield. Arthur suffered from an utterly pathological belief in the classic superstition that explicitly warned stepping on a crack in the pavement would magically result in the catastrophic, instantaneous spinal fracture of his sweet, elderly mother. While normal human beings simply use the sidewalk to casually walk from point A to point B, Arthur treated every single pedestrian commute like an extremely high-stakes, life-or-death Olympic gymnastics routine, intensely hyper-focusing his entire field of vision straight down at his expensive leather loafers. Now, as anyone who pays taxes knows, city infrastructure is notoriously terrible, meaning the concrete path to Arthur's office was absolutely littered with a chaotic web of jagged fissures, shifting tectonic plates of pavement, and wildly uneven cobblestones. Arthur was heavily engaged in a manic, aggressive game of urban hopscotch, bizarrely stutter-stepping, wildly leaping, and abruptly halting his forward momentum to avoid the microscopic concrete canyons, completely irritating every single pedestrian trapped behind his erratic movements. The glaring problem with intensely staring at the ground while navigating a densely populated metropolitan grid is that it completely unplugs your brain from the loud, fast-moving, multi-ton realities of vehicular traffic actively operating just inches away. Arthur approached a particularly dilapidated corner, where the massive roots of an old oak tree had utterly destroyed the surrounding pavement, creating an unpassable, terrifying maze of cracks that his superstition-addled brain mathematically calculated as an absolute mother-paralyzing trap. Sweating profusely and consumed by absolute panic, Arthur frantically scanned his immediate area for a safe, unbroken surface, his eyes desperately locking onto a beautifully smooth, freshly paved patch of black asphalt just slightly to his left. Without throwing a single glance upward or acknowledging the aggressive ringing of warning bells, Arthur executed a spectacular, highly athletic lateral leap off the safety of the curb, triumphantly sailing through the air to land perfectly clear of the offending lines. Unfortunately for Arthur, that beautifully uncracked patch of asphalt happened to be located exactly between the gleaming steel rails of the city's incredibly heavy commuter tram system. He achieved a brief, glorious millisecond of absolute victory, firmly believing his mother's lumbar spine was entirely secure, right up to the exact moment the 8:15 morning express tram, a merciless, screeching behemoth of electricity and unforgiving steel that could not possibly stop in time, violently deleted him from the city's census records. In a wildly ironic conclusion to his lifelong crusade, Arthur valiantly sacrificed himself to protect his mother from an imaginary rhyming medical emergency, only to cruelly inflict upon her the very real, horrific trauma of having to legally identify what was left of his mangled briefcase at the county morgue. 7. Deep in the heart of Appalachian folklore exists a highly specific, deeply unsettling superstition, explicitly stating that if a pair of shoes is placed upon a table, it is an absolute, undeniable omen that a tragic death will imminently occur within that very household. This bizarre piece of antique mythology absolutely terrified our next protagonist, a highly anxious, profoundly superstitious man named Wyatt, who had recently relocated from a remote cabin to a remarkably sterile modern apartment on the 10th floor of a bustling city high-rise. Wyatt lived with a chronically disorganized roommate who possessed absolutely zero knowledge of obscure rural curses. A completely oblivious guy who casually walked into their shared kitchen after a long shift and thoughtlessly slammed his massive, mud-caked steel-toed work boots directly onto the center of their laminated dining table. When Wyatt locked eyes with the offending footwear, his rational brain immediately shut down, instantly replaced by a blinding, primal panic. As he concluded the Grim Reaper was practically already waiting by the couch to claim a soul. Instead of simply picking up the heavy boots and placing them on the floor like a rational adult facing a mild sanitation issue, Wyatt fundamentally believed that the only way to successfully break this lethal household curse was to violently remove the cursed objects from the premises in a matter of desperate seconds. Operating on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and absolutely zero spatial awareness, he practically tackled the dining table, snatching up the heavy leather boots in a frantic grip and initiating a wild, manic sprint directly toward the completely wide-open living room window. Here is the critical, fatal flaw in Wyatt's chaotic curse-breaking strategy. His apartment featured a notoriously treacherous, highly slippery decorative area rug that his roommate had repeatedly warned him was an active tripping hazard just waiting to claim a victim. As Wyatt hit his maximum sprinting velocity, fiercely winding up his arms like an Olympic hammer thrower preparing to launch the footwear out into the skyline, the toe of his sneaker violently caught the heavily bunched-up edge of the treacherous carpet. The sudden, violent deceleration of his feet absolutely did not stop the massive forward momentum of his upper body, instantly transforming his heroic, curse-breaking sprint into a violent, entirely uncontrollable head-first dive directly toward the open window frame. He forcefully launched both the heavy boots and his own rapidly accelerating body out of the 10th-story window simultaneously, experiencing a terrifying freefall before making a devastating, painfully final introduction with the bone-crushing concrete sidewalk 100 feet below. In a textbook case of self-fulfilling prophecies, Wyatt's frantic, desperate attempt to prevent a theoretical death from occurring inside his apartment successfully guaranteed that an incredibly real, devastatingly physical, and unquestionably permanent one occurred just a few feet outside of it. 8. A pitch-black rural highway at 2 in the morning, nothing but whispering pines and a massive, historically significant cemetery flanking the cracked asphalt. This was the nightly commute for a deeply paranoid, hyper-anxious driver named Trevor, a man who had elevated the childhood game of holding your breath past a graveyard into a rigorous, non-negotiable survival protocol he executed with the aggressive intensity of a military drill. Trevor genuinely believed the air surrounding tombstones was heavily contaminated with paranormal activity, completely ignoring the deeply ironic fact that oxygen deprivation is actually a mathematically guaranteed method for instantly turning yourself into a ghost, and his fundamental lack of basic biological understanding was about to violently prove that point. As the glowing headlights of his heavy 2-ton SUV illuminated the first wrought iron gates of the graveyard, Trevor tightly clamped his mouth shut, firmly pinched his nose with 2 fingers, and confidently prepared to easily outlast the perimeter of the haunted real estate. Unfortunately for Trevor's deeply flawed risk assessment, this wasn't a small family plot. This was a massive, endlessly sprawling necropolis that stretched alongside the dangerous, curving road for well over 2.5 continuously terrifying miles. As he stubbornly maintained his ridiculous vehicular breath-holding contest, pushing past the first agonizing minute, the carbon dioxide rapidly building up inside his bloodstream initiated a series of severe, compounding physiological alarms that his folklore-poisoned mind stubbornly chose to ignore. His face turned a vibrant, terrifying shade of violet. His peripheral vision rapidly collapsed into a dark tunnel, and his highly oxygen-starved brain began critically misfiring, severely compromising his ability to operate a heavy mechanical weapon. Still absolutely terrified of inhaling a spectral hitchhiker, Trevor proudly refused to gasp for the incredibly abundant, perfectly safe air circulating inside his cabin, right up until the exact inevitable moment his central nervous system mercifully shut down to protect itself. Trevor completely lost consciousness, his heavy foot violently slamming down onto the accelerator as his limp, slumped body suddenly yanked the steering wheel sharply to the right, sending the massive SUV careening entirely off the paved asphalt. He violently blasted through the decorative cemetery fencing at 70 miles per hour, instantly terminating his journey with a catastrophic, unquestionably fatal, head-on collision against the unyielding trunk of a massive, centuries-old oak tree located deeply within the graveyard's perimeter. Trevor brilliantly managed to avoid breathing in any dead spirits, instead rapidly fast-tracking his own paperwork to become a permanent, wildly inconvenient resident of the exact same property he was desperately trying to avoid. 9. 7 years of guaranteed bad luck? That's the ancient cosmic sentence supposedly triggered by shattering a mirror. And for our next phenomenally misguided victim, those 7 years compressed into roughly 4 screaming seconds of freefall. The doomed man in question was Julian, an incredibly vain, hopelessly paranoid amateur interior decorator whose deeply flawed critical thinking skills had been completely short-circuited by this superstition, causing him to firmly prioritize pristine home aesthetics over his own skeletal integrity. Julian was in the highly stressful process of single-handedly rearranging the heavy patio furniture on his absurdly narrow third-floor apartment balcony, ignoring the basic logical reality that moving massive, unwieldy objects at high altitudes is absolutely a 2-person job. His pride and joy was a ridiculously heavy, massively oversized, ornately framed antique mirror that he had recklessly propped up against the remarkably low metal balcony railing, while he swept the concrete floor beneath it. Due to a catastrophic miscalculation of the object's incredibly top-heavy center of mass, a completely predictable gust of urban wind caught the expansive surface of the glass, causing the towering antique to slowly, horrifyingly, begin tipping backward over the protective railing and out into the empty abyss. When Julian spun around and witnessed his highly reflective prized possession beginning its undeniable descent toward the unforgiving pavement below, his brain did not calculate the sheer, terrifying drop or the fragility of the human spine. Instead, his heavily superstitious mind was instantly overwhelmed by the absolute terror of enduring exactly 2,555 consecutive days of guaranteed cosmic punishment and profound personal misfortune. Driven entirely by a frantic, wildly illogical impulse to save the heavy glass and preserve his mystical aura, Julian didn't just gently reach out for the frame. He impulsively launched his entire body violently forward, executing a desperate full-extension superhero lunge directly over the low metal barrier. In his frantic, adrenaline-fueled scramble to desperately establish a firm grip on the rapidly accelerating mahogany frame, He completely, spectacularly failed to realize that he was actively transferring his entire physical center of gravity directly into empty, unsupportive space. He triumphantly managed to seize the edge of the heavy antique mirror in a miraculous display of last-second hand-eye coordination, only to instantly realize the horrifying, unbreakable laws of physics dictated that a 180-pound man cannot successfully anchor a falling object while standing on absolutely nothing. Julian and his intensely protected antique mirror embarked on a brief, terrifyingly unified, high-speed descent together, rapidly plummeting 3 stories down before simultaneously impacting the brutally unforgiving concrete sidewalk in a catastrophic explosion of shattered glass and irreparable structural damage. In the ultimate, deeply sarcastic display of cosmic justice, Julian brilliantly succeeded in avoiding 7 years of bad luck by actively, permanently, and violently canceling every single year of his remaining natural lifespan in an instant. 10. If you are carrying a massive, incredibly awkward load of heavy objects down a steep flight of stairs, basic survival instincts dictate that your primary focus should be entirely on maintaining a stable center of gravity and meticulously watching your incredibly precarious footing. Unfortunately, these logical survival protocols were completely absent from the fiercely superstitious brain of our final victim, a heavily paranoid man named Eugene, who found himself engaged in a high-stakes, deeply stupid battle of wills with a completely indifferent feline. Eugene was a man who treated old wives' tales as absolute scientific fact, completely terrified of spilling salt, walking under ladders, and, most fatally, the devastating curse of allowing a black cat to cross his direct path. The scene of this spectacular tragedy was the dangerously steep, absurdly narrow, heavily splintered wooden staircase leading down into Eugene's cluttered, dimly lit basement, a treacherous architectural nightmare that already demanded extreme caution even under the best of circumstances. Eugene was recklessly attempting to navigate this vertical death trap while blindly carrying a massive, towering stack of heavily overpacked cardboard boxes that weighed well over 40 pounds, completely obscuring his vision and severely compromising his already highly questionable physical balance. Roughly halfway down his perilous descent, a scruffy, entirely unbothered stray black cat casually sauntered out from the shadows and decisively parked its furry body directly in the absolute center of the wooden steps. When Eugene peeked around the massive cardboard mountain and spotted the void-colored animal blocking his descent, he didn't just pause. He completely froze in absolute terror, convinced that his soul would be instantly doomed to eternal misery if he simply walked past the creature. Rather than gently shooing the animal away with his foot, or sensibly retreating back up the stairs, Eugene's panicked brain mathematically calculated the absolute worst possible solution to his highly specific mythological dilemma. Refusing to let the creature cross his path, he stubbornly decided that the only viable option was to execute an aggressive, soaring leap completely over the cat, launching himself from the 4th step up while still desperately clutching 40 pounds of heavy cardboard. Now, Eugene possessed the physical grace and aerodynamic capabilities of a cinder block, completely lacking the explosive leg strength required to successfully propel his own body weight, let alone an additional load of cumbersome basement storage. The very second his poorly positioned sneakers desperately pushed off the incredibly narrow, wooden tread, his laughably terrible athletic calculation became undeniably obvious, as gravity instantly vetoed his majestic flight path. He miserably failed to clear the distance, his leading foot violently catching the edge of the lower step, instantly pitching his entire heavy body wildly forward in a completely uncontrolled accelerating tumble of limbs, flying cardboard, and profound regret. Eugene bypassed the remainder of the wooden staircase entirely, launching headfirst through the dusty basement air like an unguided missile before coming to a bone-shattering, definitively terminal halt directly against the immovable, solid concrete foundation wall. The spectacularly apathetic black cat barely even blinked at the violent chaos unfolding above it, casually watching Eugene eliminate himself from the gene pool before calmly standing up, stretching, and casually strolling right across the exact path the deceased man had just so desperately died to protect. All right, I need a verdict. If you were the lawyer for the universe, which of these 10 victims would you successfully sue for completely wasting oxygen? Drop your primary suspect in the comments so we can roast their legacy. And hey, skipping the like and subscribe buttons is basically a guaranteed curse of endless buffering. Don't tempt fate, click them now and prove you actually have a pulse.